Hey guys, welcome back to the P-Squared Biology Podcast. This time around, I'm going to talk about some special sharks. I'm talking about the Hammerhead sharks and a kind of interesting paper I found about their decline and possibility for extinction. I thought initially it would have been talking about their chances of extinction in natural environments. But the elephant in the room is people are killing them out, and at alarming numbers. And it's kind of depressing, but hammerhead sharks are one of the more interesting and underrated shark species. And reading this paper, there's some definitely interesting trends, even if it's depressing. Of course, graduating with an environmental science degree, I know all about that. I could talk on about that, but these sharks have been around for tens of millions of years at least. There seems to be a lot of sources saying they've been around for 10 to 20 million years, but there's also other sources saying they've been around for 40 million years since the Eocene, and I think that's probably the case. Maybe somewhere in between. Nobody knows for sure since you're just finding their teeth. Can't really prove if they had a hammer or not. But yeah, they're definitely special, and we'll talk about that paper. So first, let's talk a little bit about hammerhead sharks and what they are. Of course, they're carcharodontiform sharks, which comprises most of the modern species. They're all predatory. There's about 8 or 9 species, one of them being discovered a few years ago off of North Carolina. And they're not all created equally. You have the small, very common bonnethead sharks. Well, especially in the Tampa Bay, they're pretty darn common. They only grow up to like 5 feet. They don't really migrate much, I don't think. Actually, I think they do migrate. They can be found all around Florida year-round. Of course, it's typical for hammerheads to kind of move up north to the cooler waters in the summer, and then during the winter, they come down to the warmer waters. But that's not true for all hammerhead species, apparently. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have the largest, the great hammerhead, growing up to about 20 feet long. And they have big teeth, big broad teeth, compared to the needle-like teeth of the bonnethead. They eat pretty much anything they want. But, of course, with that hammer-shaped head, their mouths only get so big. So their prey selection is kind of limited as to what they can sink their teeth into and tear apart. Even though you hear all the time about and see videos of them eating hooked tarpon, which I always found that interesting, and even eating other sharks. So in general, they're not the man killers that people make them out to be, but at the same time, they're apex predators that will eat pretty much anything, even though they really specialize in stingrays, which, reading books about them, it's crazy. People have found like 80 stingray barbs in the head of a shark. You're like, man, doesn't that hurt? But apparently the venom doesn't really affect them. It might be coevolution, both of them being elasmobranchs. They're definitely specialized to eat rays. But in general, hammerhead sharks are not really specialized in the traditional sense. The traditional definition being that they have a very restrictive range or dietary preference, which the paper seems to kept describing them as specialized. I'm like, what are they talking about? They live all over the place, and they eat pretty much whatever they can sink their teeth into or that they can swallow. But the paper, the more I read into it, describes how it's actually based on a definition from another paper from 2015, which defines specialization with special regards to ecology, behavior, and function. Basically saying they have specialized, They have specialized habits, behavior, and just the way they function, which I think in a way might be in attempts to help with conservation. The more you say, hey, these are specialized creatures. So, even though clearly if one of their prey species went extinct, they wouldn't go extinct, and they're found all over the place relatively. They can be found inshore, they can be found way offshore. So they're not too specialized, but there's definitely predictable patterns with them that make them very vulnerable to extinction. Which, of course, being sharks, especially the larger ones, the great hammerhead, the scalloped, and what was the last one? And the smooth hammerhead, being that they become sexually mature much later in life, after several years, unlike bony fish, which pretty much within a year, if not months, they can reproduce and really bounce back from extinction events, local extinction events. Even though they're being so overfished, even they are vulnerable to extinction, but sharks are really vulnerable to extinction, especially those bigger ones, because you're killing them out before they can bounce back. And it's especially the case with the smooth hammerhead, because they're so social, predictable migration patterns. Have you ever seen documentaries or shark footage on Netflix or on TV? You've probably seen those massive schools of scalloped hammerheads. Those are the ones that really, there will be hundreds, if not thousands of them. And I read a book that this guy, Dr. Peter Klimley, studied scalloped hammerheads and actually dove with them and figure out the most likely functions of those schools. And it has a lot to do with apparently reproduction and just being social in general. But of course, he figured before really studying them, like, why the heck are they schooling, since typically schooling fish are small prey fish that have many predators going after them. Like, why do they need that protection? Because there's not many predators that can take them down. But the more he studied them, it had a lot to do with being social and establishing dominance for mating. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So, being so into fossil hunting and paleontology of sharks, you may ask, if hammerhead sharks have been so successful for all these years, why aren't their teeth showing up in the fossil record that well? Especially Florida, given they have really good shark fossil record for the Miocene, the peak of shark abundance. And actually, you do find their teeth. The problem is that most of them are small. So to the untrained eye, they might not look like much, but the more I collected the smaller teeth, I started finding some. And I have one right here from the Peace River. It's not too broad or anything, it's just kind of curved a little bit. And then I have some smaller ones, one from Gainesville and one from the Mulberry Phosphate Museum. And they're definitely distinct. They're not a lemon shark tooth, nor a bull shark tooth, or they kind of look similar to bull shark lowers, I guess. But they're just they have a weird root sometimes. It might be a little bit bulky, but overall not too huge. They have this valley in the middle of the root a little bit. The tooth cusp it looks more like a lemon shark. It's not too broad, but not too skinny either. But the most defining factor is there's a little notch on the shoulder of the tooth, in between the root and the tooth cusp. There's a little notch, and that's how you can really tell you have a hammerhead shark tooth. Whereas sharp nose shark teeth don't have that notch and are usually more needle-like and smaller. So they've been around, they've been very successful, but of course now they're even though their prey is still very abundant and they still inhabit a lot of niches worldwide, of course they're getting killed out because of unsustainable fishing practices like long lining. And it was interesting to read this, but also kind of depressing, that there's a 60 to 80% mortality rate when hammerhead sharks are caught as bycatch in commercial fishing, which I think has a lot to do with them being hooked. They get really stressed, and because of all that stress and they're trying to escape, they get exhaustion, and or they might not be able to swim well enough to pump water through their gills. That's why you have that super high mortality rate, which is not that good. And I meant to say hammerhead shark teeth don't get that big, maybe half an inch max. Most of the ones I find seem to be about a quarter of an inch. I don't know what the centimeter conversion is, but they're not that big. And the more I've read into it, it seems it has a lot to do with the evolution of their head, becoming specialized in a way to converting their head to the sensory function of having that hammer. And there's several advantages of that, because they have their head somewhat on stalks a little bit, if you can call it that, off to the side of their heads. They have a full 360 degree vision of sight, so they can see anything within their vicinity perfectly, from far behind them, above them, below them. Really good eyesight. Of course, they have really good lateral line system, ampullae of Lorenzini, to detect weak electrical fields. They have really good sensory function of that. And because their head has more of those ampullae of Lorenzini, it's really good for detecting buried prey. I'm pretty sure they've done tests on this, that they can find fish or stingray hidden several feet beneath the sand. They'll detect them perfectly and be able to kind of dig out the sand and fish them out, eat them. And I've seen videos of them chasing stingrays. They really seem to love those things. I don't think I've ever eaten stingray, but I heard they taste good, kind of like scallops, I guess. I've seen people at the Skyway piers hacking those things up. I probably wouldn't do that. I mean, I like fish, but it just seems kind of dangerous and kind of unnecessary. I'll let the hammerheads stick to what they do, and I'll do what I do. The one time I did catch a stingray, it felt heavier than it actually was, because I guess they really use those powerful muscles to try to stay at the bottom. A lot like sharks, like most of their body is just straight muscle, and that might be why they taste so good. A lot of meat. I don't know. So yeah, back to talking about the schooling behavior of scalloped hammerheads. The more in this book I read about it, I'm bringing this up kind of to be supplemental to the paper, because you can, just knowing the fact that scalloped hammerheads school doesn't really gain much insight into what makes them special. So I thought this book really went into good depth from first-hand accounts of studying hammerheads. So basically, most of the hammerheads in those massive schools are females, and he said it's kind of doesn't make sense if it's used for mating, because you'd think there'd be more equal distribution between males and females if it was truly just for mating. But you also had to take into account females grow larger than males, and they might be swimming offshore to find more prey so they can become larger, and as a result be more competent for developing more offspring, because dominant females are the ones who are having all those pups, which great hammerheads apparently can have something crazy like 40 offspring. They probably found a record great hammerhead. I want to say the one a little bit over 10 years ago had 40 pups in it, which, yeah, that, I'm not too big of a fan of trophy world record fishing. It's cool to find out what their max size will be, but at the cost of losing an apex predator who has a lot at stake for the survival of the species, I don't think it's worth it. Especially now with the knowledge that those hammerheads are birthing a lot of pups. And I think that was the one that was like 1,200 pounds. Like, holy crap. And even the guy who caught it and killed it, or, they never survive. They need it to be dead for the record to count. Even said afterwards, like, this is 20th century mindset, kill the monster. The seas will be safer, when in reality, the ocean and even human life will be much worse off if there were less sharks. And I developed the webpage a little while ago with tips on how to help save sharks just in your daily life, things you can do and things to avoid. I'll provide that link again. But definitely there has to be economic and social impacts to humans, as well as all ocean life, with the demise of these great apex predators. You had that in North Carolina with the decline of the scalloping industry. With more cows raised out there, they were eating up all the scallops. So without those apex predator sharks, those rays, just their numbers exploded and just wreaked havoc on the environment. So yeah, too much of anything, just creates those imbalances, and then the environment is much more susceptible to just collapse. And I'm sure it's already experiencing that, since it says scalloped hammerheads in a lot of its range has declined over 90%, which that's just unexcusable. That's just ridiculous. Like, sure, you can slap on the label that they're now protected, they're endangered, but that's just don't even fish after them. You can fish after bonnetheads. Those are super common. They're small. They have that shovel-shaped head. If you're fishing near shore, you're catching a bunch of these, chances are you're catching bonnethead. But if you're going after large hammerheads, I definitely don't condone that, especially with all the red tide lately. I haven't seen or heard about any dead hammerheads, but you never know. It wiped out a whale shark and some sea turtles. I don't see why hammerheads wouldn't be caught in the crossfires as well. But I'm getting sidetracked. So with regards to the paper describing how they're specialized, that has several subcategories, one being Ecology Specialization. The 3 largest hammerheads have big brains, so how they have higher cognitive abilities and that social intelligence, with them schooling and having those predictable migration patterns, definitely makes them susceptible to overfishing, which makes them susceptible to extinction. The book is called The Secret Life of Sharks. Really good book. I only really cherry picked it a little bit for the hammerhead information, but it went really into good depth describing their migration a little bit along the California coast, how they go toward the north in the summer to cooler waters and then back down south during the colder months to have that optimal temperature, and how they function. But also thought it was really neat how they congregate around seamounts, and seamounts are raised underwater structures that are on their way to becoming islands but haven't made it to that point yet. And these are really rich, diverse centers of ocean life. These hammerheads, or at least the scalloped hammerheads, congregate there during the day in those massive schools for social interaction, maybe to get it cleaned, have those cleaner fish clean out their mouths, I'm guessing. But mostly it has a lot to do with that social interaction with those females vying for the top spot. And the book goes into this a little bit, how most sharks in those schools are under the size range to be sexually mature. So why are all these immature sharks schooling? It doesn't really go into it too much. It's just speculation. Maybe it has to do with preparing for when they do reach sexual maturity, that they've been seeing other sharks and how they establish dominance. There's just less large sharks in general because they have to survive longer, eat more, and maybe there's other sharks that would still be in schools, but maybe they didn't establish that dominance, so they're not into schooling as much anymore. But definitely goes on to say that some of the larger females are toward the center of the school, and that's the dominant position where they had the most mates and they're just the center of attention, whereas toward the edge of the school you have the smaller, less dominant sharks. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, these are really social, unique, smart animals, especially how they use their body language to establish dominance as well. It's not just females trying to be the center of attention, it's also the males that are sometimes twisting and turning their bodies to get the attention of females and win over those dominant females. Whereas the other sharks, it seems like they're mostly solitary. They do their own thing except for mating, which is more violent than anything. It seems like these hammerheads have more consent. That's a whole nother story. But yeah. Along with them being social and really smart, another ecological specialization they have are how sharks in general are more built toward quality over quantity. If it wasn't for humans, they would still be very abundant, very thriving, because they mature later in life. And once they establish themselves, they can, because they don't have many predators, they can live a long time, apparently. I don't think they live much longer than 20 years, maybe longer. I think I read somewhere they live up to 40 years for one of the species. Maybe I'm thinking about a different species of shark. But they're definitely, they're not like bony fish where they only live a few years and they can reproduce really quickly. They're more built toward quality over quantity. I guess this kind of ties into it too. The paper went on to explain their behavioral specialization, with the scalloped hammerheads being in schools of hundreds of individuals, which is hard to believe unless you've seen pictures or video of it, but they definitely do it. As well as their, again, I already talked about this, predictable migration patterns. They always go back to the same seamounts to interact with each other, so that definitely makes them, even though they're not feeding there apparently, I guess they could still be caught with nets, or probably be optimistic predators maybe, having easy prey right in front of them. Apparently, because they do that during the day, they'll form those massive schools and generally not feed, but then at night they'll travel extensively away from the seamount to feed alone, up to like I think 10 miles is said. And the way they find their way back to the seamount every day is kind of interesting. They detect the magnetic pulses through the magnetic fields in the earth, it seems, or it says right here, the strong dipole fields associated with seamounts, which is not too surprising. Sharks can detect weak electric fields, especially hammerheads, very, very well. So I think whales can do it too, a little bit, to find their way through migrating through the ocean. Oh yeah, and I missed this point. When it was talking about ecological specialization, it brought up their viviparity, how they reproduce very similarly to mammals. But all cochoroniform sharks, except for target sharks, have this, where they give birth to live young with a placenta while they're still in the uterus. But again, even small sharks that aren't close to extinction have this trait. So I think that was more just appealing to the pathos, to whoever's reading the paper more than anything, even though it's still a unique feature that's pretty neat in my opinion. But also it goes into saying how great hammerheads, and I'm sure other hammerheads too, how they actually, I think it's mostly great hammerheads that are both pelagic, they're in the open ocean, but also right near the coast, how they feed on the tarpon sometimes. How that puts them at risk for extinction because they cover more ground. They're probably run into fishing fleets more often, or less often because they move away from them maybe, I don't know. But definitely because they're pupping in those shallow coasts near humans where they're fishing, that definitely puts the newborns at risk. And when you put the newborns at risk, that's not good for the future, of course. And that might have had something to do with the extinction of the mega sharks in the Miocene. Those might have gone outcompeted a little bit, and or with their loss of habitat, with less, because ocean levels went down because the glaciers were forming. So with less pupping grounds, that means less young being born, but you also had whales moving toward the poles as well. That definitely had something to do with it. But this video is not about the extinction of the mega sharks. I've already talked about that. But before talking about the proposed shark protection measures, which the paper brought up, which I thought some of them were pretty interesting, I want to say how the shark's hammer is probably getting smaller in recent years, and no one knows why, but I think I have a hypothesis of why that might be. Because many sharks are going extinct, especially since the Miocene. You have the extinction of the megalodon, the Physogaleus, Hemipristocera, a lot of big predatory whales. I think they might be more generalist predators now than they used to be. Maybe back in the day, with all those other predators, they're more specialized toward feeding on the bottom and chasing those stingrays. I know there's not much way to prove this just based on finding their fossil teeth, but maybe they couldn't feed after all those squid and fish as proficiently as the other predators, and or maybe they're just more proficient at bottom feeding. They've always been pretty proficient at catching whatever they can fit in their mouths. Sharks are the perfect ocean predators. Their sensory abilities are off the charts. They're super fast. They can detect a little bit of blood in record time, and unless something overpowers it or outsmarts it, pretty much they're on the top of the food chain. But also I liked how it said just because hammerheads are big sharks and big sharks are more prone to extinction, the case with tiger sharks, even though they're also big, they're much less prone to extinction, which I'm happy about in a way. They're my favorite modern shark, but it's also kind of sad in a way because they're both unique. They hold very special places in the ecology of ocean life, because tiger sharks, for some reason, when they're caught, they have much lower stress levels, and as a result, they don't die as bycatch anywhere near as often. Even though you have shark finners out there, they'll take whatever they can get, but as bycatch, that has a negative impact as well. So even though they accidentally caught the sharks, the hammerheads will be killed regardless, whereas tiger sharks will have higher survival rates. Yeah, it's surprising. It's clearly said that they show low stress responses when hooked and extremely high survival rates. But also because they're really great generalists, they'll eat whatever the heck they want, even humans, birds, even garbage. Tiger sharks will eat pretty much anything. And I've read books about this. There's just no exceptions. It just goes on to list what they'll eat. I'm just thinking, man, just pretty much say they'll eat anything they want. They've eaten some weird things. Garbage, like I said, humans, catfish, other sharks, pretty much anything. Apparently now there's even a stabilizing trend for tiger sharks. They're not even declining. Apparently this is from a 2010 study. Even though in general large sharks are declining in numbers because of overfishing, because of the exploitation of those younger sharks, which in natural environments would be becoming those new apex predators. But when you're killing out the big ones and the smaller ones, that's not good. So what are the proposed possible shark protection measures? Well, definitely, paper brought this up, avoid peak areas or peak periods of shark abundance. I think those huge hammerhead schools should definitely be protected. I think if they're catching any hammerhead sharks, they should move on to somewhere else, because with those scalloped hammerheads, where you find one, especially during the day, you'll find many. Even though in the book it went on to say how they're chasing after those sharks, and this is just a quick side note, they were chumming and they were trying to find all those hammerheads. They're like, where did they go? Like, what the heck? It turns out when they scuba dived with typical equipment, they were running away. Apparently they get spooked really easy, so they had to free dive like dozens of feet, just free diving, holding their breath to study the hammerhead sharks. I was like, heck no. I might scuba dive someday, but I couldn't imagine myself diving down 60, 70 feet even to see those big sharks. I'd rather just snorkel or something. I'm not going down that deep without oxygen. I don't know, to each their own. But swimming sharks should be fun regardless. Adjusting fishing depth or leader material. It doesn't go into much depth about that, but of course using J hooks are much more prone to hooking the gut of sharks or fish in general. You should be using circle hooks because that has a much higher chance of hooking them perfectly in the jaw. Improving shark handling. If you watch documentaries about how they catch hammerhead sharks and release them safely, even though I'm sure that still puts a lot of stress on the shark, as long as they do it quickly and efficiently, that should help protect them. Reducing sharks' detection of baited hooks. You can't really affect that much, because sharks will pretty much chase after anything. But actually that has a lot to do with, I found this really interesting, how the type of hook has a high impact of whether hammerheads will bite it or not. What they found was these lanthanide hooks were made of a type of metal which produces an electrical field in salt water that actually deters those sharks. So something to do with, you'd think sharks would be chasing after those electrical fields. There's a really neat YouTube video where it shows bonnetheads feeding in a little lagoon-like setting, and they actually chase after those electrical fields thinking it's prey, where in actuality there's nothing there. So their senses are telling them, hey, there's an injured fish or something swimming about there, you chase after it, but it's actually just an electrical field. Which is kind of torturous in a way, but I thought it was really interesting. But here they're finding those lanthanide hooks actually deter sharks. So I think that should become the norm. Like, there's no reason not to use those hooks, even if it's more expensive. It'll be much less expensive in the long run if they're protecting those sharks and keeping those ocean ecosystems intact. Whereas if you allow those sharks to die out, and everything will be negatively affected. So again, just in summary, the paper states how hammerhead sharks are very vulnerable to extinction based on the current fishing practices, based on how they behave, how they get stressed out really easy, and how they school. Of course, in conjunction with how they mature later in life, and they can't just bounce back as quick as other types of fish. Even compared to other large sharks, they're in very high risk of extinction. And it even listed how much they've declined in several regions in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and around southern Africa. And everywhere they sampled or they listed, they've declined an alarming 76 to 99%, actually closer to the 95+%. That's just unacceptable. And I think everyone should make it a practice to support sustainable fishing, which, if you see the link below in this video, definitely support sustainable fishing, because you might not think, oh, I'm just going to buy this tuna, this has nothing to do with hammerhead sharks, but actually has a lot to do with it. And reducing plastic, reducing your consumption of unsustainable goods in general, especially buying those shark products, like buying modern shark jaws and buying those cosmetic products. Like, that's just a gimme. Like, just don't buy those. Buying fossil shark teeth is fine, of course, because they went extinct a long time ago, unless somehow the extraction of those has something to do with the decline of sharks, but I'm not seeing it. Yeah, they're special and vulnerable, even though they're not specialized in the traditional sense, because they can be found inshore, offshore, and eat a wide variety of prey. But they're definitely specialized enough that even though they're not being targeted all the time by long lining and traditional wasteful fishing, they're still dying out as a result. It's not just the shark finning, which even shark finning, that causes decline of sharks in general, because they're just cutting off their fins and they're just automatically doomed. It's depressing. Don't buy shark fin soup or any shark product from unsustainable shark sources. And again, eating bonnetheads, that's fine. Not all hammerheads are at equal risk of extinction, but definitely it's those larger ones, the scalloped, the smooth, and the great hammerhead. Actually, the scalloped hammerhead became officially endangered a few years ago, which is good, but you never know, they might go extinct or near it in our lifetime if things don't improve. So yeah, definitely, if you want to go swim with some, definitely look into that and spread the word about how to protect them. And the more attention that can be brought to them, the higher chance they might have. You never know. So yeah, because this talk or podcast was less lighthearted, I didn't want to talk about my personal life, random things in general as much. But as for personal updates, haven't gone fossil hunting in a little while or fishing, but I'll probably do that soon. Living around Tampa, if anyone's into that, wants some company, kind of getting into comic books a little bit. We'll see where that goes, but I'm open to recommendations. Oh yeah, I'm going to be pretty much a senior spray tech in my job right now with herbicides. I hadn't done it in a couple years, and now it's not official promotion, but something, being in charge of my area. You know, don't have it perfectly down yet, but I'm getting there. I can make an episode about herbicides. You know, they're not all evil. The dose makes the poison. All of them can be safely used in moderation. So yeah, if you guys have any disagreements, questions about this material, fossil hunting, sharks in general, any requests for future content, let me know. And yeah, I think that's about all I have. I think this talk went on a little bit longer than expected, but just some good stuff. Yeah, I mean, not just because hammerheads are really unique and cool sharks, they should be saved. They have a really special place as apex predators in the marine ecosystem, really keep things in balance. I've seen Bonnethead sharks, even though they're not too impressive, they're really special too. There's actually a paper that said how they're actually omnivorous. They eat plants too, not just fish and invertebrates. I thought it was really neat that there's hammerhead sharks and they're really varied. But even the extinction of one of them would have major detrimental environmental impacts. But yeah, that's about it. Alright, thanks for watching. Alright, see you.